someone who has gotten really overwhelmed by my massive TBR, to be watched piles, and for me using themes to kind of hone in on the kind of books I'm trying to prioritize during this year has been super helpful for me. So for the month of March, I was focusing on books with either musical themes or motifs or kind of references basically as criteria for choosing which books I was going to be reading for this month. I get to try things I may not have given a shot prior because now I have this theme and it's pushing me, motivating me to explore the book world more. For the most part, I loved all of these books. There's no one book in this video that I wouldn't recommend for somebody. I think they have like specific audiences, so it's all gonna come down to your taste. But if you found something to be kind of intriguing, definitely give it a shot and let me know what you think. Up first is Welcome to the Show, 17 Horror Stories, One Legendary Venue, edited by Matt Hayward and Doug Murano. This past year, I've been getting more and more into short story collections and anthologies. And one thing I'm noticing I really love and appreciate about an anthology is when it centers around a specific theme or a setting. Everybody who contributed to this short story collection had to set their stories in one way or another at this musical venue called the Shantyman. The first story in the collection touches on like its origin story and like the mythos surrounding how this one specific place gets all of its like bad vibes and kind of paranormal, supernatural, otherworldly connection. And then the last story is kind of like looking into the future when it comes to this specific space in this like really odd and scary dystopia. And then everything in between, you're jumping across this timeline of American history, and the stories in one way or another touch on this specific space. So the venue in every story comes up. If you are a music lover and you understand the worlds of true crime and specifically like California history, like myself, you will really love this book because you'll pick up on a lot of the references. This short story collection is interesting because these don't really feel like short stories to me. They're super short. Some of the longest stories are like 10 pages, some of them are like half of that. And so to me, it really feels like it is one story telling different kind of snapshots of this one venue in different time periods, whether it's 1800s, the 1960s, 70s, 80s, 90s, like it's everywhere that this story goes. And there's this one central location that is staying still as time is flying by around it. You really get a sense of place. This venue is the main character in all of these stories, and I'm somebody who lives about like an hour or so away from San Francisco, so I really understood so much that the story was trying to communicate that it didn't necessarily need to tell me because I already understood the lore, the history, the environment of that specific city. So if you're somebody who's maybe not like super into short story collections, this might be more your jam. I think of it as more like story fragments. It's kind of like if you were to put a camera, somehow have this technology, even in the 1800s, if you put a camera in the corner of that venue and you just had the world kind of go by and you're a witness to it, like a fly on the wall, this I think is what you'll get. I really felt like at the end of this book, I knew this place and I had so many questions and not everything was resolved. And I think that is cool because you're not necessarily this all-knowing being as the audience. You kind of just get that fly on the wall experience while you're within those four walls of that musical venue. If you're a fan of American Horror Story Season 1 with the Murder House, I think this short story collection will be right up your alley. It's kind of like what I'm trying to communicate, that you have this one space, this one mysterious place that people are going in and out of, time is flying by, and there's something about it that's otherworldly, that's supernatural, that kind of, I don't know, fuels people and their madness and their darkness. It's just a magnet for all of that. Next up is The Ballad of Black Tom by Victor Lavalle. This is my first Victor Lavalle book, so I kind of came in with a bit of high expectations, and I think that did not really help my reading experience of this book. I read it for the Week of Weird, and before this, I read the short story based off of this by H.P. Lovecraft. It's something about like Red Hook. So I didn't like H.P. Lovecraft's story, besides the fact that it's racist. I think it's like just a bad story. I didn't know what was going on half the time. And I feel like the same kind of experience I had with Victor Lavalle's book, where I'm like, okay, what is happening? Like, where are we? Maybe that's a me thing. Like, I think maybe Victor Lavalle just might be too much for me in ways that like Stephen Graham Jones writing is, where like I kind of have to grow into their work and kind of come back to it, revisit it as I kind of become a little more literate within the fiction and horror worlds. But I absolutely loved his social commentary within this book, to tell the story in a way that I thought was super unique with that revenge arc. Felt very cathartic and interesting and refreshing for me to kind of explore history in a very different way. Especially when you see how awful Lovecraft's short story is. It's really cool to see the Black character take center stage, because Lovecraft's xenophobia and his racism that shows up in a lot of his short stories, not just Red Hook, is not just exclusively him. It was very much of his time period, and so I think it was a really cool way of reimagining the story and what it could look like, to then also embed a lot of the conversations American society is having today regarding over-policing of communities of color. Ultimately, I feel like the story needed a little bit more character development, a little bit more information about the world, about the more odd, weird stuff that was going on. But I think that I will continue to give Victor Lavalle's work a shot. I know people speak highly of The Changeling, so I won't count him out, but I just don't think this is a good beginning for me and his work. The first book I actually read this month was The Festival by Christopher Golden. I received this book in one of my Nightworm subscription boxes a few months ago, so I didn't seek this one out. I'd never heard of it prior to receiving it. This is why I choose to subscribe to horror book subscription boxes, because I don't know everything that's out there, and it's cool to kind of like challenge myself and be exposed to new books, and this one was a total hit for me. I think it's a very unique novella where you have these illustrations that are so beautiful, so unique. All you really need to know is that it centers at this music festival, and it has a really storied past, like super ancient history that's really dark, really cruel, that took place at that space, at that venue, thousands of years ago. I think this novella starts off with a bang, with a lot of mystery, where you're just already asking questions, and I think novellas really need to start that way. I thought the characters were really unique and interesting. I mean, in a novella, I feel like you don't have enough time with multiple characters to really be invested in them all, but I did care to a relative degree. There was a lot of characters, so there wasn't any singular one that I thought I knew really well by the end of the book. But overall, I really love this novella, and like a few of the novellas I've read recently, I really feel like it would have been better served as more of like a fuller length novel. Kind of like the Ballad of Black Tom. I feel like that would have been better as a full length novel as well. Like, I just wanted more, and because you have a lot of characters in the festival, I felt like you need more page numbers to kind of get at what their motivations were. But I feel like, I don't know, I was really intrigued by the premise and what had gone on. I wanted more. Another book I read relatively earlier in the month was Theme Music by T. Marie Vandelly. This was one of those books where I literally had no clue what it was about. I hadn't heard anything from BookTube, Bookstagram about this book. I found it on my Libby app by just searching up music books within the horror genre, and this came up, and I'm like, sure, why not? It's categorized within the horror genre. Couldn't hurt to give it a shot. I think this book takes the weird award for my month's reading. Like, it is so strange, it is so weird. The main character is morally ambiguous and gray. It's kind of like a tug of war in your mind. Like, is she good? Is she bad? Like, is she the victim? Or is she actually like perpetrator in these situations? Or maybe she's like everything. So that made it kind of fun. I didn't really know where to kind of peg her, because I feel like that's where my mind goes. Like, should we empathize with this person, or are they the bad guy? Like, who moves into the home that they were the lone survivor of a mass family killing? I don't know, maybe that's like the way you heal. But you see, as things unfold, there's an interesting cast of characters. Everybody's super distinctive, has their own motivations. You're questioning people. It's kind of mysterious. There's also like a mystery element in this too. So the horror is a little bit on the lighter side, but I found a lot of other things to be super rich and captivating that I didn't necessarily need big elements of horror to find this story interesting. I think the one thing that tripped me up as I read is that this is like a pretty long book. Like, it's on the lengthier side, and I felt like the narrative and the inner monologue was a little bit too windy for me. We spend a lot of time in her head, and it's kind of a weird place. I just felt like there's just a little bit too much time in her head, like just a little bit too windy of a road to get to where we needed to. And I think maybe the inner monologue parts of the story could have been tightened up a bit. I think if you liked Just Like Home by Sarah Gailey, you would really enjoy this book. I think this book does a better job at executing a main character that we don't like and that we're kind of questioning their morality. We Sold Our Souls by Grady Hendrix is the second Grady Hendrix book that I have read so far in 2023. That first one was How to Sell a Haunted House, which is his newest release, which I haven't really talked about on this channel, but I did not really care for. I'm on that controversial side of people who found it to be just a little too long, despite the fact that I love grief horror and I loved all of like the little puppet nonsensicalness that took place in that book. But I have very little qualms, very little problems with We Sold Our Souls, which I found to be fantastic. I know this is not one of his more treasured books within his backlist, but I found it to be incredibly entertaining. I listened to this as an audiobook and I thought that the narrator really gave me that vibe of Chris, the main character. Just the voice and the way she talked and her mannerisms that I could like hear. I think it was just like the perfect reading experience for me. I really loved Chris. And I know sometimes when there are characters that are super like meek and passive, it can make me feel really frustrated. And I think Chris had a little bit of that in her, but I never felt frustrated by her. I felt like she always had that part of her remaining from her early youth that like she was just kind of putting on the back burner and waiting for the right moment to harness again. This book is interesting because I don't think too much happens, but I enjoyed it. It was kind of like this revenge road trip, trying to get yourself back in the driver's seat of life. And although I think there was a lot of parts of this that were lost to me, like that whole like Black Mountain mythology that was a part of like their music and like how Chris was trying to imagine the situation that I didn't know if it was like real or not, or if it was just like a metaphor. It surprisingly didn't keep me from really enjoying this book, and I feel like the ending was like a smidge convoluted to me, but I don't know. I felt like I really thought that it was more like the journey rather than the destination, and what I found the most joy in experiencing is seeing Chris get back on the horse of life and in the driver's seat again. I got kind of worried with my lackluster experience reading How to Sell a Haunted House, so it was nice to know that I'm still a Grady Hendrix fan after reading We Sold Our Souls. Like, it was the perfect redemption arc for me. And if I had to choose, one of my all-time favorite books from this month is gonna be Disco Deathtrap by Cameron Roubique. Oh, I love this one so much. Even though I knew from the beginning what the end of story reveal was gonna be, I had a blast. It really isn't about the reveal, just like any slasher. It is about the experience, it's about the kills, it's about the tension, it's about the ways in which you use a space, in this case a roller rink, to tell a story that is horrifying and also like fun for the reader. Definitely not for the characters. This book is set in the 1980s. It is a fantastic setting that is really well utilized. Like, this was the perfect book to read for my musical March theme. The music is a huge part of the story as well. You have the first 100 pages setting up the stories of all these characters. Largely they're like high school students, but you do see some young adults mixed in there. I think it did a pretty good job of setting up some interesting red herrings. I just did not fall for them. However, what I definitely fell for was these characters. As I was reading the book and I was trying to get through those first 100 pages, I felt like it was super slow and kind of tedious. I'm like, oh, when is the slashing gonna happen? But I think it was super important as I got into the slashing. I noticed like I really cared for these characters because I knew their backstories, I knew their relationships, I knew their hopes for the future, because it is set on New Year's Eve. And so because I had that really good deep setup, I felt like when the slashing happened, I was like, oh no, not them. And it was fast paced, it was fun, it was gruesome in all the best gory ways. I thought the roller rink setting was well utilized. You kind of really feel like at the end of this book that you've gone through like every nook and cranny of that place. And if you're somebody like me who grew up going to roller rinks, you already have that image in your head of yours. And so I really had this clear image. The book I felt like this related most to is gonna be Cirque Berserk. So if you were a fan of that book, I think you will really love this one because you have that slasher element, you have a different time period, you have a really unique setting. I think they pair really, really well together. And this one's like a little bit longer. If you wanted more from Cirque Berserk, more backstory, more plot, whatever, I think that will be amended in Disco Deathtrap. I'd love to know what has been your favorite book you've read in the month of March, and did any of these books pique your interest? I'd love to know down in the comments. I feel so amped. I feel like I had a great reading month. I think using themes to pick and choose off my list has been such a great thing. I'm such a planner that like, I think this is the best course of action for me to feel like I have a game plan when I'm knocking off books that I really want to read or movies I really want to watch. And speaking of movies, in the month of March, I also revisited one of my favorite horror films, Jennifer's Body. If you're a fan of this movie, I highly suggest you check out my video where I explore its release and how it has evolved into a cult classic, despite the fact that it was a total dud by critics when it came out in 2009. As always, thank you so much for watching. I'll see you all in my next video. Bye!